Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to be asked to introduce our speaker this evening. I realize that he is already well known to many of you, which makes my job much easier. For a comprehensive report on his abilities and accomplishments would take far more time than I have tonight. Our speaker is the eldest son of the Honorable Ezra Taft Benson, former Secretary of Agriculture and one of the world leaders of the Mormon Church. A graduate of Brigham Young University, he served as a foreign missionary for the Mormon Church for 3 years, and later as an Air Force chaplain during the Korean War. Our speaker joined the John Birch Society in 1962 after more than a year of intensive study. He was soon made field coordinator for the society in Utah and southern Idaho. In 1964, he was appointed to the public relations staff of the John Birch Society and moved to Washington, D.C., where he now serves as the Society's Washington representative. In addition to his duties in Washington and speaking engagements that take him from coast to coast, he is also a contributing editor of the Review of the News magazine. And last, but far from least, he is the proud head of a family that includes 6 young children. As you can see, our speaker is a man who carefully balances his responsibilities and his time, a subject he will surely be mentioning tonight. He realizes that it is not enough merely to talk about loyalty to God, family, and country. He practices what he preaches, but responsible action must be based on accurate information, and that is what we are here tonight to get. Accurate information about what is happening to our country and what we must do to protect and strengthen our republic. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great privilege to introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Reed A. Benson. Reed.
I'll bring the mountain closer to Mohammed if Mohammed won't come up closer here tonight. If it's a little hard for you to hear back there, you feel free to come up in the front here, and maybe it'll be a little easier for you. I'm mighty grateful for the privilege of being here tonight, and I appreciate your attendance, too. I'm sure there are probably many other things you could be doing tonight besides being here, but you're here, and we appreciate it. And I would hope that some of you are here tonight to discharge what I consider one of at least 4 basic duties that every one of us have. You have duties to your God, or to break it down further, let us say you have duties to your church, you have duties to your family, you have duties to your country, and you have professional obligations. That is to say, you have to provide the bread and the butter. Church, home, country, and profession. You can't give them equal time, really, but you need to give them consistent time. Otherwise, you don't merit the full blessings of a kind providence. Now, I guess it's not difficult for a man to succeed in business, really. Perhaps all he needs to do is forget about his church, neglect his family, overlook his civic duties, concentrate all of his time on his profession, and he'd nearly have to be mentally incompetent not to succeed. The kind of people we need today in the life and death struggle against the forces of atheistic communism are the ones that can balance their time, their limited time, in every one of those 4 basic areas. And it's not easy to balance that time. In fact, the communists are counting on us getting our life out of balance, concentrating on the things of lesser worth. As one good woman put it a little while ago, don't worry about your cake in the oven if your house is going down in flames. The balancing of time, selecting of priorities. I say it's not easy to balance that time. Some of you will recall what happened in my own family a number of years ago. For a good part of my father's adult life, he's had to travel a lot in a government or a church capacity, and that's meant, of course, he's had to be away from home. And I'll never forget when he came home one day from one assignment, and we were so happy to see him, and we all gathered together to break a little bread and have a meal. And then he had to leave on another assignment, and so we all went out on the porch to wave goodbye to him. My younger brother, Mark, my 4 younger sisters, Barbara, Beverly, Bonnie, and Beth. And as we stood on the porch to wave goodbye to him, my sister Barbara, who was just a little girl at the time, as she waved goodbye, she made an interesting comment. She said, "Goodbye, Daddy, and come back again and visit us sometime." And you know, that was a real shock to Dad. And it reminded him that with all the delegating he could do, he couldn't delegate his duties as a father because there was no other success that could compensate for failure in the home. And you know, with all the delegating you can do, you can't delegate your duties to preserve your individual freedom because there's no excuse that can compensate for the loss of liberty. And so I would hope maybe some of you are here tonight, maybe because of a love of the Lord. You know, the good book says that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Or maybe some of you are here tonight because of a love of family, your children, your children's children, and you'd like to leave a little legacy of liberty for them. Or maybe some of you are here tonight because of a love of country and the men that laid the foundation thereof. You see, it's a part of the doctrine of my religious faith that the Constitution of the United States is an inspired instrument, drafted by wise men whom the God of heaven raised up unto that very purpose. In fact, the Constitution of the United States is as much a part of my faith as the Ten Commandments. And therefore, when men start tampering with that Constitution, they're tampering with my faith. Maybe that's in part what impelled some of you to come tonight. In any case, I'm mighty grateful tonight for my American citizenship. I remember a number of years ago when I was overseas as a missionary, one day in one of the newspapers there appeared an ad, and the man submitting the ad said that he would give one of his eyes to medical science if someone could guarantee to him American citizenship. You know, I had 2 eyes to read that ad with. My citizenship hadn't really cost me much. I guess I was a lot like the children of Israel. Maybe a lot of us are. I had drunk from wells I hadn't dug. I'd plucked from trees I hadn't planted. I was the beneficiary of a marvelous legacy. I think of those Pilgrim Fathers. That was a rough winter, that first winter. They had a ship that would have taken them back, but they preferred the coldness of freedom rather than return to the warm fires of tyranny, and they stuck it out, and I'm glad they did. I spent some of my early years in school at Maryland. I'll never forget the story of Charles Carroll. He was one of the men that signed the Declaration of Independence, that great document of human freedom, and as they walked up to affix their signature to what could have been their death warrant, really, if their cause for freedom hadn't succeeded. As they walked up to affix their signature, Hancock was standing there. You remember Hancock, how he signed his name? So big. So big he said he'd done it so King George wouldn't have to put his specs on to read it. And along came Charles Carroll of Maryland. And so the story goes, as Charles Carroll walked up to affix his signature, Hancock twitted him a little bit. He said, "Why, Mr. Carroll, there are so many Carrolls in the state of Maryland, they'll never find you." And you know, interestingly enough, Charles Carroll is the only man that signed the Declaration of Independence and left his address. You know that? And you can find it next to his signature today in the archives there. Tremendous souls. I live in Virginia today, my adopted state, I guess I could say. I think of Tom Nelson. He signed that Declaration of Independence. Tom Nelson. The British captured his home. And I guess they figured, inasmuch as Nelson was leading the fight against them, that one of the safest places to quarter their officers would be in Nelson's home. Because after all, no man would lead the artillery to bomb his own home. They didn't know Nelson. Tremendous souls. And then after they'd won their independence, I believe under the inspiration of heaven, some of the wisest of our father's children gathered together and drafted a document that Gladstone was to refer to as the greatest document ever struck off at a given time by the brain and the hand of man, the Constitution of the United States. And that constitutional republic they set up became our form of government, and the fruits of that system are these: that though we're only a small part of the population of this world, on a small part of its land area, still we have given more of the good things of life to more people under this form of government than any other form of government on the face of the earth today. And yet it seems there must needs be opposition in all things: light, darkness, virtue, vice. And so over on the other side of the world, satanic forces were moving among men to design a counterfeit to our way of life. Men like Marx. Marx was a socialist and atheist. A typical socialist, anxious supposedly to solve the problems of the world while he let his own fireside go to pot. A typical socialist. Marx designed a beautiful scheme to solve the problems of the world. And some of the most dastardly deeds in human history would be performed by this conspiracy while they were waving the banners of peace and brotherhood and agrarian reform and even in our day, civil rights. Marx said his life was dedicated to two things. He wanted to dethrone God and he wanted to destroy capitalism. Imagine, dethrone God, destroy capitalism. Those are the very two pillars upon which we built the greatest civilization on the face of the earth today, a love of God and a love of freedom expressed through an economic system known as free enterprise capitalism. And communism was spawned. Marx died. Other tyrants in embryo took his place. By 1917, they'd taken over their first country, Russia. And since that time, I'd run out of breath before I ran out of names of countries they've since taken over. You know, it's hard for you and I to grasp the fact that in one country alone since World War II, the communists have liquidated enough people to equal the population of 25 of our states. The combined population of 25 of our states. Can you grasp that? That country, Red China. We are faced today with murders incorporated on a scale never before known, before whom the Caesars and the Genghis Khans and the Hitlers couldn't even hold a candle compared to the Khrushchevs and the Mao Zedongs in our day and age. And still we're asleep. Asleep in the face of an enemy that has murdered more people, enslaved more people, drugged more people than any conspiracy in recorded human history. But do you know what one of our problems is? It's the monstrosity of this thing. It's hard to comprehend it. J. Edgar Hoover said it well in the Elks magazine back in August of 1956. He said, quote, "The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. The American mind simply has not come to a realization of the evil which has been introduced into our midst." How true. And now I'm about to reveal to you what I think will be recorded as one of the all-time tragedies of history. And that is this: that communism would probably be relatively insignificant in the world today were it not for the consistent and persistent help which it has received and is increasingly receiving through the government of the United States. A tragedy. Communism, when left alive and left alone, is like a parasite. That is to say, it has to exist on a living thing. When communism is left alone, it eventually collapses of its own dead parasitic weight. It has to cling onto a living thing to stay alive. Weaved, kept it alive. On communism today could be put the stamp "made in the USA." Let's go back to the 20s. 1921 to 1925, tens of millions of dollars in machinery and equipment were pumped into the Soviet economy by American industry. In 1930, the Ford Motor Company began establishing the Russian motor car industry. In 1930 and 31, General Electric supplied the first power system in the Urals. The firm of Albert Kahn, Incorporated of Detroit, designed and constructed some 570 plants for the Soviets. Another American firm, the Hewell Cooper Company, contracted with the Soviets to supervise construction of the hydroelectric plants throughout Russia, and one result was the huge Dnieper Dam, which at the time was the largest hydroelectric station in the world. A Cleveland firm made Magnitogorsk in Russia, the biggest iron and steel works in the world, and so the list goes on and on. Now, what motivated those American firms and businessmen to build up communism? Was it the love of money? Was it the love of power and prestige? Whatever their motives, it certainly wasn't the love of the Lord, the love of light and liberty that moved them to build the power of the devil, of darkness, and of dungeons. Whether deceived or diabolical, the end result of their actions has proven a tragedy. Now, if we love the Russian people, and we should, why do we help their slave masters to stay in power? We shouldn't hate the communists, only the evil things they stand for and do, but to love our enemy does not require us to encourage him in his wickedness, or to see that he prospers in his evil. For to do this is a grave sin. Yet that's exactly what we have done and are doing today to keep communism alive and millions in bondage. Now, the communists have said they intend to bury us. What would you say if somebody came in your neighborhood and said to you, now look, I intend to kill you and enslave your children? And you think to yourself, my golly, what a buffoon. I don't believe him. And then you happen to look around the block and you notice the dead bodies of several of your neighbors, and you notice a third of them have been locked in their homes and this man has the keys. And then you realize that he told all of those people in advance before he did it he was going to do it. And now he's telling you. But he says to you, unfortunately, I can't kill you right now because I don't quite have the strength. What I think would help me would provide the strength for me is a loaf of bread. Would you sell me a loaf? Or better still, would you give it to me on credit? Now, would we? Years ago, Lenin said the American businessman is so stupid he'll pay for the rope that hangs him. And that's the status we're in today. Dr. Werner Keller wrote the great book, The Bible is History. He concluded his book, East minus West equals zero, by outlining Russia's debt to the West. And this is what he stated. All that the West stands for, all that it has achieved and is still achieving culturally, technically, and scientifically has been done without a single important contribution from the Russians. If the Russians had never existed at all, it would have not made an iota of difference to what the West has to offer all humanity. The present position of Russia, had she not been taught, helped, and supported by the West, would be unthinkable. Even at this moment, Russia can only keep up by the continuous theft and exploitation of every new development in the free world. I had the privilege a little while ago of addressing the Herbert Hoover High School student body out in Iowa. Professor Anthony Sutton of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, in his book, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, has documented in detail and according to the most scholarly methods two vastly important conclusions. First, that all the modern industry in Russia was put there with help from the countries of Western Europe and especially from the United States. And second, that American firms which deal with the Soviet government are sure in the long run, unless they're backed by our government, to lose heavily rather than make a profit on the deal. In the 1920s, the Soviets admitted Western capitalists to Russia as concessionaires, but as soon as the enterprise in question showed any signs of returning a profit to the concessionaire, the Soviet government would tax away all operating profits and expropriate or confiscate the plant and equipment. End of quote. Well, some will ask, if we love the Russian people, why wouldn't we want to ship them wheat, keep them from starving? After all, they can't shoot wheat at us, can they? It's precisely because we should love the Russian people that we wouldn't want to ship them wheat. Do you know why? When any business in this country deals with the communist, a communist country, they have to deal with the communist dictatorship. It isn't a dealing between a business here and a private business in a communist country. It's a dealing between a business here and the communist dictators. Now, when our wheat goes to Russia, do you think they equitably distribute it equally among all the Russian people? Are you kidding? Are they concerned about starvation in Russia? No, unless it's communist starving. And the communists only have a maximum of 5% of all the Russian people are communists. Therefore, when the wheat comes into the hands of the communist dictators, what do they do with it? Do you think they'd put it in the mouths of anybody that might be their future enemy, potential enemy? Of course not. So far as starvation is concerned, does that bother them? Of course not. Khrushchev a few years ago was in charge of the forced starvation of millions of peasants, farmers in Russia. Forced starvations never plagued them at all. Then what do they do with the wheat? They use it as a political instrument, maybe to offset some needs of food, but then it can be re-exported to other countries. It can be used for industrial purposes. And then there's this factor. An army still has to travel on its stomach, doesn't it? As I used to say. The more food you send them, the less men that have to be out in the fields planting and harvesting. Therefore, the more hands that are free to work where? In the armament factories. You see, in Stettin Harbor in Poland, the same harbor where we bring in our wheat, on the other side of the harbor, they ship out goods to the Viet Cong to kill our men. No, it's because we should love the Russian people that we wouldn't want to ship their slave masters wheat that can be used as an instrument against them. Now, I'm about to tell you what I think is a shocker. At least it is to me. And that is this. When you investigate closely what the communist goals and objectives are currently for this country, you will come to find out that the communists are achieving a measure of success in every one of their objectives at this time. Now, how do you determine what the communist goals and objectives are? Well, it's not difficult. One of the best ways to do it is to go to the communist publications themselves. The means they use of communicating with each other. Now, while the communists are probably the arch liars of all time, they do have to tell the truth once in a while. When they're talking to each other, they get totally confused. And so one of the best ways to determine exactly what they're up to is to go to the publications themselves, their own publications that they use to communicate with each other. If you do that, you'll come to discover, once you find out what their objectives are, that they are achieving a measure of success in every one of the objectives they're pressing for in this country to bring our downfall. Now let's go back to January 29th, 1964, when J. Edgar Hoover was appearing before the House Subcommittee on Appropriations. He was telling that subcommittee what the communists were pressing for in this country, domestically and internationally. And this is what he had to say about the Communist Party in the United States and what they wanted internationally. Quote, on the international level, the party is dutifully echoing Soviet propaganda regarding peaceful coexistence and peaceful competition, disarmament, an end to nuclear testing, and increased East-West trade. Now let me ask you a question. Are they achieving any success in any one of those areas? Why, it's obvious, in every one of them. Let's pause on the last one. Increased East-West trade. During the last presidential campaign, candidate Nixon on February 22nd, 1968 in Superior, Wisconsin, told more than 500 people at a meeting in a Lutheran church that the United States should adopt a new policy of no trade and no credit for any country dealing with North Vietnam. Now, he based this proposed new policy on the fact, as he put it, that Soviet Russia and its satellites were supplying North Vietnam with 85% of the sophisticated material used in the war against South Vietnam and the United States. And the American people agreed. No more aid and trade to the enemy that is helping to kill our men in Vietnam. And so they voted for a change. What's happened since they voted for that change? Well, in this particular area, so far as aid and trade to the enemy is concerned, it is on the increase since Mr. Nixon became president. In spite of the fact that he ran on a Republican platform in 1968 that asserted that nations hostile to this country will receive no assistance from the U.S., we will not provide aid of any kind to countries which aid and abet the war efforts of North Vietnam. In spite of the fact that the 50th Annual Convention of the American Legion In New Orleans on September 12, 1968, candidate Nixon asserted that there should be no trading with any nation, including the Soviet Union, that aids the enemy in North Vietnam. In spite of those pledges, today the aid and trade of the enemy is on the decided increase. Do you know what you could do to verify that? Is simply write our Commerce Department and ask them if they would send to you their latest quarterly report of licenses which they grant for the shipment of goods from this country to the communist countries that are aiding the Viet Cong. Let me give you a few figures from the first quarterly report of 1970, and it gets progressively worse since then. To the Soviet Union, over $10 million worth of steel sheets, over $7 million worth of aluminum oxide. To Poland, chemical intermediates, over $2 million worth of steel sheets. To East Germany, machinery, tungsten ore concentrates. To Czechoslovakia, carbon black for the manufacture of tires. To Romania, steel sheets and chemical intermediate. To Hungary, glassworking machinery. To Yugoslavia, over $11 million worth of refined copper, over $26 million worth of aircraft. Then on April the 14th, 1971, the Nixon administration announced that we would export to Red China now rubber, steel, lead, computers, machinery, glassworking industries, generators, motors, transformers. I said it's gotten increasingly worse since the first quarter of 1970. For instance, on one day alone, August the 9th, this past August, 1971, the Commerce Department announced the granting of 2 licenses for exporting of $162 million worth in foundry equipment to build the Soviets' truck manufacturing complex. Now, when a country wants to produce tanks, planes in time of war, etc., where do they go? Car manufacturing, truck manufacturing. You know, the Founding Fathers, in order to protect our constitutional republic a number of years ago, spelled out the doctrine of treason in our Constitution. Treason, they stated, was to give aid and comfort to the enemy. Well, then the question is, who's the enemy? Well, it should be obvious by now. After all, the communists have liquidated over 70 million people in their rise to power. They've published our obituary in advance. They've been murdering and subverting our boys for years. Then if the communists are our enemy, what then do you call it? When the government of the United States sends billions of dollars of foreign aid to communist dictators. Oh, some people say, Mr. Benson, you don't understand. This has been going on for some time now. That I know. And it nearly proves the couplet that Sir John Harington wrote centuries ago when he said, treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? For if it prosper, none dare call it treason. Well, don't you see it's been prospering? And who dares call it treason? Well, some people say, but Mr. Benson, you don't understand. You see, about $2 billion worth of this foreign aid went to Tito, and you see, Tito's a different type of communist, isn't he? I mean, doesn't he get upset with Moscow once in a while? Maybe. I'm not entirely convinced that that's true. I think he usually gets upset with Moscow just before the foreign aid bill's voted on in the Congress, but maybe. But that should give us small comfort, because Tito's a communist. And every communist is dedicated to our burial, even if they argue between themselves over the funeral arrangements. Now, Tito's a communist. He's indicated an all-out war between us and the United States, between the Soviet Union and the United States. He's on the side of the Soviet Union. So we've sent him billions in foreign aid, trained his pilots. I mean, what would you do with the chief of police in your area if he took your tax dollars and gave it to Babyface Nelson because he heard that Babyface Nelson and Dillinger had a spat the night before and he was betting on Nelson? Well, that's ridiculous, isn't it? Both of them are enemies of the public peace and public order. And so treason has been prospering. And who dares call it treason? One of the tragedies of the last few years in our foreign policy is that we've been friends to our enemies and enemies to our friends. Let me give you one typical case. A little while ago, President Nixon assured the Romanian government, communist government of Romania, that though we might disagree with their internal policies, we certainly wanted to maintain the very best of relations with them. He had a telegram delivered to the Marxist head of Chile to indicate to him basically the same thing. Now, these are communist-directed governments. But how about an anti-communist government? Well, there's an anti-communist government that the leadership today do disagree with their internal policies, but because they happen to be anti-communist, that makes the difference. And this little country is a country that a number of years ago declared their independence before the communists could take them over. And it fouled up the communist timetable. And so they decide to try and institute a boycott of the shipment of goods to this country to try and cripple this country, make it tough for them, try and bring them down. Now, this little country wants to be our friend. I mean, they're not training missiles on our shores. They're not planning to overthrow our form of government. They've even offered to send men to help us fight the war in Vietnam. The little country, as some of you know, is anti-communist Rhodesia. Now, because of the communist influence in our government, we went along with this boycott to help bring down anti-communist Rhodesia. The boycott was announced by President Johnson, has been continued under President Nixon. In fact, things have gotten worse under President Nixon, and now we've cut off our consulate offices with them in their capital of Salisbury. But when President Johnson announced the boycott, this is what he said in part, quote, "The general policy is to deny applications for such items as petroleum and petroleum products, rubber and its manufacturers, chemicals, explosives, iron and steel products, non-ferrous metals, machinery and transport equipment, electrical power and other electrical machinery and parts, automotive vehicles and parts, aircraft and parts, and other items that would make a significant contribution to the economy." Now, we will not send these items to anti-communist Rhodesia because we know they will make a significant contribution to their economy. Now, here comes the clincher. Every one of those items is approved for shipment from this country to the communist countries that are helping to kill our men in Vietnam. Now, let me ask you this question. Do you think they make a significant contribution to the communist economy? And that's a crucial question, isn't it? And while I'm talking about Rhodesia, let me tell you an interesting strategy the communists devised a while ago. It's called the weak link principle. And this is what they said among themselves. They said, let's try and get our enemies dependent upon us for some material that we would supply them and could supply them, that would be strategic for their war-making ability, so that they'll get dependent upon us, and then in case the all-out war ever comes, we'll cut off the shipment of that goods to them and help to cripple their war-making capacity. Did you follow that? They call it the weak link principle. Now, one of the materials we consider essential for our war-making efforts is a material called chromium, chrome. We consider this strategic for our war-making capacity. There are two major producers of chrome in this world: anti-communist Rhodesia and communist Russia. I want you to guess where you think we've been purchasing our chrome from, and at a much higher price than if we bought it from anti-communist Rhodesia. To show you how far we've been engaged in treasonous activities, let me quote to you an accurate statement, a proclamation issued by the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, way back on April 16, 1917. This is what he said. "The courts of the United States have stated the following acts to be treasonable," and then he lists them. Among others, the acquisition, use, or disposal of any property with knowledge that it is to be, or with intent that it shall be, of assistance to the enemy in their hostilities against the United States. And so you see how far we've been engaged in treasonous activities. Thank goodness there have been some patriots over the years that have tried to wake up the American businessman to what he's done to keep communism alive and growing. Remember back in 1968, there were a few patriots that went to the IBM stockholders meeting that year to try and persuade IBM to quit trading with the communists. Thomas Watson Jr., chairman of the board of IBM, said that IBM would still go along with the State Department's attempts to build bridges to the east. And Watson expressed the view that peace has a chance to be purchased through world trade. Now, here's one of those little interesting footnotes in history. That's Tom Watson Jr. speaking. Tom Watson Jr., naturally, is the son of Tom Watson Sr. Now, Newsweek, on November 22nd, 1937, noted that Thomas J. Watson, this is Sr., IBM president, had just made a 5-month tour of Europe, trying to promote trade with Germany and Italy. After having been personally received by both Hitler and Mussolini, Watson was quoted as saying that, "We believe that world trade is the surest road to world peace." That interesting? Like father, like son. Sounds like, doesn't it? This is just before the outbreak of World War II. And then, July 10th, 1937, Newsweek revealed that Reichsbank President Hjalmar Schacht had presented Watson with the new Order of Merit of German Eagle for foreigners who have made themselves deserving of the Third Reich. Now, isn't that interesting? That's how the Nazis felt about Tom Watson Sr. of IBM and his trade with them. How do you think the communists feel today about Tom Watson Jr. and their trade with him? And yet the sophistry, the cleverness, the deceit that's used to beguile and dupe us into supporting trade with the enemy is amazing. And unless you put their arguments together back to back, it's not easy to be deceived. But tonight I want to put their 3 main arguments together. And I'll summarize them in 3 sentences. Now you listen closely to where all of this point. Because they don't like you to do this. This becomes too obvious if you do this. But let's do it. Number 1, our trade with Yugoslavia is justified on the ground that she is independent of Moscow, and we want to keep her that way. But our trade with Moscow is excused on the grounds that she is less belligerent than Red China, and it is in our interest to keep her that way. But our trade with Red China is excused on the grounds that she is more belligerent than most red countries, and it is in our interest to do all we can to make her less belligerent. Now, did you follow that? No matter how you slice it, how does it come out? Aid and trade to the enemy all over the world for one excuse or another, isn't it? And the founders referred to that as treason. Treason. A little while ago, Harry S. Dent, the staff counsel of the White House, was interviewed. And he told this newspaper what the real Nixon political strategy was. And this is what he said, quote, "What we are trying to do is to increase our numbers by broadening our center base, both to the right and to the left. But our expansion to the left is far more extensive. Look at all we've done in 1 year that the liberals of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations never did in 8. And he ticks off a lengthy list. Withdrawals of troops from Vietnam, abandonment of biological warfare preparations, proposals for welfare reform and minimum family income, draft reform, doubling free food for the poor, closing tax loopholes, ending the security blacklist at HEW, easing trade restrictions with Red China, the SALT disarmament talks. Harry can go on indefinitely." End of quote. Just before the last congressional election, 1970, the liberal senator, Republican Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, was being asked by a reporter whether the policies of the Nixon administration were too conservative for his liberal taste. Would such policies harm his re-election chances in 1970? And the senator replied with his usual candor. Now, this is what he said. Now, listen closely. This is interesting. He said, quote, "The bulk of the president's proposals have been progressive, bold, innovative. We get the action, and the conservatives get the rhetoric." Now, did you follow that? That's interesting, isn't it? The liberals, I'd add the socialists and communists, are getting the favorable action by the Nixon administration, while from time to time the conservatives get the words they like to hear, maybe through Agnew, maybe that's his mission, to periodically say from time to time what many conservatives have said years before, although he doesn't oppose any of the socialistic and pro-communistic programs of the Nixon administration. Suffice it to say that the good book says, not all those that say, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of our Father in heaven. Words versus actions. Which do you think you'd prefer? I know what the socialists prefer. Now, maybe a good yardstick of the State of the Union today is to tell you briefly about the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. Were you a member of the CFR and would happen to divulge what would go on in their evening dinner meeting? This could be grounds for the termination of your membership in that organization. The semi-secret Council on Foreign Relations was formed for the purpose of so changing our American system that we could be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Now, so alarmed over this organization's subversive influence and increasing control over our political affairs in this country was Dan Smoot, that he wrote a book entitled Invisible Government. Dan Smoot, who served for a period of time with the FBI. Cleon Skousen, who wrote the landmark book, The Naked Communist, who served with the FBI for some 16 years, has written a sequence to that, a follow-up book entitled The Naked Capitalist, the story of the CFR. Now, perhaps a good yardstick to see exactly what is the State of the Union today is to see if any members of this group, the Council on Foreign Relations, that numbers approximately 1,400 individuals, if any of these men in that small organization, comparatively small to organizations today, were appointed or retained in positions of influence in the Nixon administration. Let me give you a partial list of the positions that have been held in the present administration, Nixon administration, by members of the CFR. The foreign policy consultant of the State Department, the ambassador of the Soviet Union, the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the ambassador to South Vietnam, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, the ambassador to NATO, the executive director of the International Monetary Fund, the chairman of the Board of Governors, United Service Organization, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, the chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the assistant of the president for national security affairs. Some of you know Henry A. Kissinger, who's made his second trip now to Red China recently. The director of the Office of Emergency Preparedness, the chief negotiator at the Paris Peace Talks, the chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, the assistant secretary of the Treasury, secretary of the Army, undersecretary of State, secretary of HEW, the assistant secretary of State for the Middle East and South Asia, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, the ambassador of the United Nations, ambassador of Venezuela, and the list goes on and on. Over 100 top appointments to government in the present administration from the organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. Said J. Reuben Clark, that great constitutional lawyer, who wrote the famous memorandum on the Monroe Doctrine, which I wish we were following today, who served as Undersecretary of State and Ambassador to Mexico, said he, I have wished to bring together and to call to your attention a number of matters, the close relationship of which it is easy to miss, and to indicate to you that so assembled they make a pattern which cannot be accounted for except on the theory that some group of minds is working out a diabolical plan for the destruction of our liberties and freedom, our divinely inspired Constitution, and the government our fathers set up thereunder, and the wiping out of our constitutional guarantees, and the free lives, the security, the happiness, and the blessings we have enjoyed thereunder. End of quote. And now the crucial question is, what can we do about it? That's the crucial question now, isn't it? Or as Hamlet would have said years ago, aye, there's the rub. In our family, as we gather around our family table, dinner table, morning and evening, for family prayers, we pray for the President. We pray for the Congress. We pray for the courts. and our state and local officers. Not that they'll be prospered in unrighteousness, but that they might be inclined to do those things that would help preserve our republic. I guess that follows a tradition in the Benson family going back many years ago. I remember my grandfather, during one presidential campaign, was out stump speaking for a candidate for the presidency, and night after night, as that family gathered together on that old farm homestead in Whitney, Idaho, as they gathered around to kneel in family prayer, whenever my father would call upon himself to lead in prayer rather than another member of the family, he pled to the Lord that the Lord would bless his candidate, that he'd be successful. Night after night, that prayer went up, and finally the election was held, and his candidate lost. The next night, as the family gathered for family prayers, all the children were anxious to know if their father was going to call on himself to pray, and if he did, what he'd say. And sure enough, he called upon himself. And in his prayer, he pled to the Lord that the Lord would bless the new president-elect. When the prayer was over, my father, being the oldest of 11 children, was delegated by the other children to ask their father how he could be so inconsistent, how he could plead so vigorously for one candidate night after night, and then finally plead so vigorously for his opponent, who'd won. And my grandfather gave an interesting answer. Yes, he said, I pled to the Lord that the other man would win. He was by far the best qualified candidate, and I could just add a footnote here and say history has certainly vindicated that. But he said, the man least qualified for the presidency won. Now, he said, can you think of anybody that needs the blessings of the Lord more than he does? And you know, I guess that's sound doctrine. Yes, we pray for the courts, the Congress, the president. Now, in addition to prayer, it's going to take more. The prophet Hosea said, my people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. A people that are anxious to preserve their freedom will want to do their homework. Now, by that, I mean they want to study reliable, accurate sources of information. Why is that important? Let me give you a typical case. In the late 1950s, the communists wanted to establish a beachhead 90 miles from our shore. Now, they had their man, and they brought him along carefully. They'd proved in the Bogota Revolution, etc. His name was Castro. They'd had him. And they were bringing him along very carefully in Cuba. But they didn't want the American people to realize who he was and what he was up to until he could become firmly entrenched, kill off his anti-communist opposition through those so-called trials, those mock trials. And then when it served his purposes, he could announce to the entire world he'd been a Marxist all of his adult life. And so carefully they were bringing him along in the hills in the late 1950s. Now the word went out through the communists, down through their transmission belt, Castro is not a communist. They didn't want the American people to realize who he was and what he was up to in time. They figured if the American people had discovered who he was, they'd exert their righteous influence to make sure their representatives back in Washington would invoke the Monroe Doctrine and keep him from coming to power. And so the word went out. Castro is not a communist. Who helped carry the Communist Party line on Castro to the American people? Well, that's interesting. In the late 1950s, what were you getting into your home to give you information on the State of the Union and world affairs, etc.? Let's suppose you were getting Look. March 3rd, 1959, you could have read these words in Look magazine. We can thank our lucky stars Castro was no communist. Or supposing you get the Washington Post like we do. Strictly for filing purposes, I add. The Washington Post, July 23rd, 1959, in a column by Walter Lippmann, had this to say. Just as it was a great mistake to treat Egypt under Colonel Nasser as a Soviet satellite, so it would be an even greater mistake even to intimate that Castro's Cuba has any real prospect of becoming a Soviet satellite. Supposing you got the New York Times, or maybe the New York Times News Service. In any case, supposing you got the New York Times. On July 16th, 1959, you could have read these words. This is not a communist revolution in any sense of the word, and there are no communists in positions of control. The only power worth considering in Cuba is in the hands of Premier Castro, who is not only not communist, but decidedly anti-communist. Well, that's par for the course for the times. What would you think had happened to a man that wrote that article? Well, in this case, he was promoted. And so the word went out through the so-called liberal news media, Castro is not a communist. Were you getting any of those publications in your home at that time? That's probably helped shape your opinion. It did to the American public. And so they were kept asleep on Castro's real purpose, true nature. But let's suppose instead you got into your home a little publication in September 1958 entitled American Opinion, edited by Robert Welch. This is what he had to say after presenting the evidence. Now, the evidence from Castro's whole past that he is a communist agent carrying out communist orders and plans is overwhelming. And then he provided the evidence. And then at the founding meeting of the John Birch Society on December 8, 1958, not 1959 now, this is 1958, Robert Welch said to those men assembled then, gentlemen, if you have any slightest doubt that Castro is a communist, don't. If he is successful, time will clearly reveal that he is an agent of the Kremlin. End of quote. Was he right? If there's one thing that certain liberal elements in this country can't forgive Robert Welch for, it's that he's been too right, too soon, too often. As he was on Ben Bella, has been on Juan Bosch, Betancourt, Castro, and numerous others. And so, may I commend for your consideration American Opinion magazine. It's now an affiliate publication of the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society has put out another excellent magazine now, a weekly news magazine called The Review of the News. And guess what? The Birch Society doesn't hesitate to sell you old copies of American Opinion. We're not even worried about you reading old copies of American Opinion. Because when you pick up an old copy of American Opinion and compare it with what's happening today, you'll see how accurate American Opinion has been calling the shots. And I could say that also about Review of the News magazine. Okay. Now, prayer, homework, then what? Probably the thing we need the most today in this country, if we're going to reverse this thing, is really a national repentance. We need a spiritual revival in this country. You know why? Well, communism is directed by Satan through men who are willing to follow his directions. Now, only men and nations who are willing to follow the direction of the Lord will be able to avoid the pitfalls and escape the cunning clutches of the communist conspiracy. Now, that's all there is to it. And that's laying it and getting out straight and getting right down to the basics. Have you a lust for power? The communists can use you, glorify you, elevate you. In fact, one of the surest routes to national political prestige today as our nation becomes more corrupted by communism is for a man to promote or espouse a part or all of the communist line. You know that? One of the ways to get glorified and glamorized today by our so-called liberal news media, and thank goodness all the news media doesn't fall in that category, but our so-called liberal news media is for a man to start espousing the communist line, and you watch. He'll get glamorized, glorified, etc. Have you lust for power? You can be used. Have you uncontrolled sexual appetites? You can be used, blackmailed, debilitated. No nation can long survive which does not put moral restraints on its appetites. Are you lazy? Do you covet? You can be lured into the welfare state by government handouts. With federal aid will come, of course, federal control and more government. And communism, of course, is simply total government, isn't it? There is no sin or weakness but what the adversary will use it not only to ensnare our soul, but to abridge our freedom and help destroy this nation. Do we trust in the arm of flesh more than the arm of God? Does our devotion run more to party than to principles? Then we can be used. Only those who love the Lord will live in liberty. Now, that's all there is to it. And the wages of sin is still slavery. I talk about devotion to party in contrast to principle. Do you know one of the tragedies is today, so far as the Congress is concerned in Washington? We've got Republican congressmen who opposed socialistic measures when they were offered by Kennedy and Johnson, but who are going along with those same socialist proposals, maybe glamorized a little more change their color just a little bit. But they're going along with those same socialistic proposals when advocated by Nixon. Simply because there is a Republican in the White House today. Now, if those proposals were wrong under the Democrats, what makes them right under the Republicans? And I'll tell you, if this country's ever going to be saved at all, it's in part going to be because there'll be enough educated people who've got a little character and spine in their backbone who'll demand that representatives go back there whose devotion runs more to principle than a party. What some men are doing today in the name of party is tragic, and it'll prove the downfall, help to prove the downfall of this country. Do you know, as we've neglected the principles of the Ten Commandments, we progressively embrace the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. You want to get a little shock? Karl Marx laid it out. 10 planks to destroy a civilized, capitalistic country, highly developed capitalistic country like ours. And as we have gradually deserted the 10 Commandments, we've embraced the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. We had Cecil B. DeMille address my old student body, Brigham Young University, a number of years ago. In his talk, you remember Cecil B. DeMille that put out the great old movies, Samson and Delilah and the 10 Commandments, etc. And in his talk to us, he made an interesting observation. He said, men and nations cannot break the 10 Commandments. They can only break themselves upon them. And I thought that's interesting. And that's true. And William Penn said years ago that men will either be governed by God or ruled by tyrants. How true. Only a people that love their independence will remain independent. Now, that's all there is to it. And I'll tell you, we can't expect to defeat the tyranny of dictatorship by being like the young man who lived with his parents in a public housing development, rode the free school bus, and participated in the free lunch program. And he obtained his degree at the state university, working part-time in the state capitol to supplement his GI education check. And upon graduation, he married a public health nurse and obtained an RFC loan to go into business. And he then bought a ranch with an FHA loan and obtained emergency feed from the government. And he later put part of his land in the soil bank, and the payment soon took care of the loan on his ranch. And the government helped to clear his land, and the county agent showed him how to terrace it. And then the government built him a fish pond and stocked it with many fish. And the government guaranteed him a sale for his farm products at highest prices. And his children grew up, entered public schools, ate free lunches, rode free school buses, and swam in public pools. And he signed a petition seeking federal assistance in developing a doubtful industrial project to help the economy of his area. And he was a leader in obtaining the new post office and federal building, and went to Washington with a group to ask the government to build a great dam costing millions so that his community could get the benefit of a temporary payroll. And he petitioned the government to give the local air base to the county. And then one day, after calculating his taxes, he wrote his congressman as follows, quote, I wish to protest the excessive governmental expenditures and attendant high taxes. I believe in rugged individualism. I think people should stand on their own 2 feet without expecting handouts. I am opposed to all socialistic trends, and I demand a return to the principles of our Constitution and the policy of states' rights. End of quote. Now, you know, too many of us are like this man. Edmund Burke once observed, men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their dispositions to put moral chains upon their own appetites, in proportion as their love of justice is above their rapacity, in proportion as their soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption, in proportion as they are more disposed to listen to the counsels of the wise and good, in preference to the flattery of knaves. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon the will and appetite is placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. How true. Okay. Now, lastly, action. Action. And to that end, I'd like to commend to you the John Birch Society as an action program. I spent a year looking at the Birch Society. There are about 3 or 4 things that impressed me about them. Number 1 was the friends they had. The number of former FBI agents, counter spies, intelligence, or security officers who joined or endorsed the John Birch Society. Number 2, I was impressed with the enemies the Birch Society had. Do you know the Birch Society has the right enemies? And let me tell you, they work hard to get them, too. J. Edgar Hoover says the best yardstick to judge your effectiveness in the fight against the communists is the degree to which the communists smear you or attack you. Well, I'd say on that basis there's no organization to compare with the John Birch Society. We've been the subject of the most vicious and extensive attack in the communist press of any other organization of similar nature, and believe you me, we're proud of it, too. And then I was impressed with Robert Welch and the leadership of the John Birch Society. Mr. Welch, age of 7, read the 9-volume History of the World by Ridpath, admitted to college at the age of 12, graduated at 16, then went on to the Naval Academy, Harvard Law School, then into business with his brother. And I was impressed with the program that he designed. Education and action, great combination. Today, the John Birch Society operates the largest chain of bookstores in America today, commonly known as American Opinion Library and bookstores, close to 500 in number. We supply those bookstores with one or more books from 100 major publishers in this country. Now, we might not agree with everything that's written in those books, but we feel they're honestly written, present a point of view our people ought to get acquainted with. And in addition to that, we have our own publishing firm called Western Islands Press that retails about $5 million worth of books each year. And that firm has put out some of the best of Americanist literature, which has been allowed to go out of print. Like the book Color, Communism, and Common Sense, put out by probably the highest-ranking Negro in the Communist Party at the time he defected, Manning Johnson. Tells how the communists used the civil rights, and are using the so-called civil rights movement to promote their objectives to use the Negroes as cannon fodder to push the communist revolution in the center. And then in addition to that, we operate today the largest speakers bureau in the free world, based on engagements filled. Some of you heard some of those speakers in your area. Men like Lee Hayes, the chief radio man of the Pueblo. I think you heard in your area just recently we've got several fine Negro speakers out, some of whom have been within the party, like Lola Bell Holmes, Jerry Kirk, Julia Brown. I think you had one of the speakers through here just a little while ago from the Watts area, didn't you? They're doing a tremendous job of taking the message out. Some of them belong to society, some don't. But each one of them has some facet, some area where they are competent in and a message to tell the American people, and we provide them that platform. Then in addition, we send out to our people a monthly bulletin. We are incorporated as an educational corporation. We feel first our people have to have the facts, because action without education can lead to fanaticism. On the other hand, education without action can lead to frustration or failure. And so we say to our people, first do your homework. And then once you've done your homework, we'll provide legal and moral programs of action that you can engage in if you want to. You're never required to do anything that goes contrary to your conscience or your judgment. If you don't like a particular project of the Birch Society, skip it. You're not required to do anything that goes contrary to your conscience or your judgment. If you don't like this month's bulletin, hope you'll get a better one next month. You're never required to do anything contrary to your conscience or your judgment. Well, that bulletin goes out. It's about 25 to 30 pages in length. Lists about 10 or 12 projects our people can engage in that month if they want. Have these projects had an impact? You bet they have. I've delivered to the Congress over 1,700,000 signatures on one of our petition campaigns, one of the largest petition campaigns in modern history. We've had over 200 letter-writing campaigns. The FFL-CIO Coke a little while ago indicated that had it not been for the John Birch Society, Abe Fortas would probably be sitting as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court today. Now, if you know much about Abe Fortas' background, you can count your blessings on that one, that he's not there on the Supreme Court today. We've set up ad hoc committees to accomplish specific tasks. Have these ad hoc committees had an impact? You bet they have. About 90% of the members of those ad hoc committees don't belong to the Birch Society. Well, we provide the literature, we provide the leadership, and they're happy to support us in these endeavors. One of the first ad hoc committees we set up was Support Your Local Police Committee. We said, look, they need our support. If we don't like the law, let's change it. Let's not take it out on the local police. And let's not give them a justification for bringing in the federal deputies. And one of the things that the communists have been pressing for years is the setting up of civilian review boards over the police as the Marines are harassing them, making it tougher for them to do their job. Backward step for law enforcement, J. Edgar Hoover referred to it as civilian review boards. And so, you recall when Lindsay ran for mayor, he said if he was elected, he was going to institute a civilian review board in New York City over the police. He ran, he was elected, he instituted it. And there was a member of the John Birch Society that passed that first petition to get the issue of the civilian review board on the ballot so the people in New York could vote on it. And then sufficient signatures were obtained, it got on the ballot, and who was for it? All the big guns of liberalism were for it. The communists had been, of course, for years. Lindsay was for it. Rockefeller was for it. Javits was for it. Bobby Kennedy was living at the time. Senator Kennedy, he was for it. And yet, when the vote came in, as you'll recall, the Civilian Review Board was soundly defeated. And when the communists tried to figure out how it could have happened, they blamed two organizations, one of which was the John Birch Society. Well, we've had other committees, the TAC Committee, Truth About Civil Turmoil, the Train Committee to Restore American Independence Now. Our most recent committee, Motor Read, the Movement to Restore Decency. First major task of that committee, get sex education out of the schools and into the homes where we feel it belongs. Now, we saw a pattern developing over the years. Government got into education, set up government schools, sometimes referred to as public schools. Then, in addition, attendance was made compulsory, wasn't it? And then, by Supreme Court edict, God was taken out of the government public schools. And then came the big press for sex education. Now, isn't that interesting? Force the kids to attend, take God out of the school, then press hard on sex education. You can't properly teach sex without the guidelines, the prohibitions that the Lord himself has laid down on the subject. But take God out of the school. You see. The leader of the national organization pressing for sex education said, the old thou shalt nots do not apply anymore. No one from on high tells you how to live your sex life. Sex isn't something you just do in marriage. And we saw the pattern. We realized what had happened in Sweden. They've had compulsory sex education for years, have the highest VD rate in any civilized country in the world. We saw the pattern. And so we instituted the program, and we said, look, if the parents aren't doing their job, then strengthen the arm of the parents. Don't usurp their rights. Besides, what makes these professional educators think they're going to be so good at teaching sex? They've had such a tough time teaching Johnny how to read. How come they're going to be so good in that area? And so we said, look, we see what's happening. We're going to oppose it. And so we did. Now, there were noble people in this fight before we ever got in. Thank goodness there were. But did you notice, as soon as the Birch Society put their oar in the waters, how you began to hear about it all across the country? And basically, as a result of the efforts of the John Birch Society, one school board after another turned down or turned out sex education in the schools. Now, I could keep you here for a good part of the night tonight, telling you about victories of the John Birch Society and about what our individual members have done. What Captain White did. The plaque is there representing Captain White in one of the airports here in New York City. You read maybe about his story in the Reader's Digest a number of years ago, how those two planes that collided in midair, how he brought that plane down, did a tremendous job, and how he got the people out of that plane and then went back, do you remember, to rescue a Negro boy that couldn't get out, and both he and the Negro boy died as a result. Captain White, member of the Birch Society. Reader's Digest didn't happen to mention that, but a member of the John Birch Society. How about Reverend Delmar Dennis, another good Bircher, faithful Bircher? I read about him in the Reader's Digest last fall. Why? Because in the condensed version of the Reader's Digest, it told about Don Whitehead's book. Murder in Mississippi was how it was captioned. Told the story of the 3 civil rights workers that were murdered and buried in the dam. You remember that story? And it told in that condensed book version of how on the day of the trial, the days of the trial, on the 3rd day, it was the Reverend Delmar Dennis who gave the devastating testimony that helped indict the man that masterminded. How come? Because Reverend Delmar Dennis, that member of the John Birch Society, had been asked by the FBI to go within the Ku Klux Klan. He did. He did his job brilliantly. And he got close to the powers that be, and he supplied that devastating testimony. Reader's Digest failed to mention that he was a member of the Birch Society, but this just goes to show the caliber of people that are in the John Birch Society. Some of the finest people it's been my privilege to meet are members of the John Birch Society. And so we're growing in numbers and in influence. Now, the communists know it. And they've tried to put us down. One of the first ways they planned to take care of us after we were set up and organized was to give us a silent treatment. We know all about that. They figured if they just didn't say much about us, we'd dry up, sort of blow away out of discouragement. I know what the silent treatment's like. I spoke at a university in the Rocky Mountain country a while ago. At the invitation of the student body, the place was packed. The kids were sitting in the aisles. They were sitting in the windowsills. I spoke for an hour on the Birch Society, then answered questions from the floor for an additional hour, then answered additional questions around the podium when that was done. And a story was turned into the evening newspaper of the state. Not a single word appeared. Now, there was a certain liberal professor on that college campus, and there are a few scattered here and there. And he decided that he wanted to hold a meeting to attack me and the Birch Society, and I'd defend him in that right. He held a meeting, only pulled about a third of the crowd we pulled, only talked for about 35 minutes, took off as fast as he could without answering a single question. There was a nice 2-column write-up
about what he had to say in that same evening newspaper. Now, we know what this is like. In fact, one of the Birchers said a little while ago, after seeing our notices put so, if they appeared at all in the newspaper, put so far back, usually on the obituary page, that he said he now thought he knew what Khrushchev meant when he says, we'll bury you. We've just seen this happen time and again. And yet, you know, in spite of it, we've continued to grow in numbers and in influence. And the communists decided to reverse their tactics. And in December of 1960, for the first time in the history of the Communist Party, they published a manifesto from Moscow outlining the necessity of defeating the anti-communist movement. The one organization that was to bear the brunt of that attack was the John Birch Society, and it started in the spring of '61 with their West Coast Communist newspaper. It spread to their East Coast Communist newspaper, The Worker, here in New York. The last half of '61, with the exception of about one issue, every issue of The Worker contained from 1 to 7 separate attacks on the Birch Society. Now, those attacks wouldn't have hurt us if they'd stayed in the Communist press. Unfortunately, the Communist Party line went down into its transmission belt. And that's when you heard about us. When Life and Time, Look, and the New York Times began attacking the John Birch Society. That's when you and I heard about the John Birch Society. And when it came, the Birch Society pleaded for an investigation. They asked the United States Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, will you investigate us? They asked the California Senate Fact-Finding Subcommittee on Un-American Activities, will you investigate us? California Senate took us up on it. Their chairman was Hugh Burns, a Democrat, the president pro tem of the California Senate. They published, after a 2-year investigation, a 25,000-word report on the John Birch Society. Every member of that committee, be a Democrat or Republican senator, signed the report, no minority report. And when all the facts came in, they said the old charges that we were secret, subversive, fascist, un-American, anti-Semitic just didn't stand up to the evidence. And we encourage you to even read that report if you'd like. Quite a report. And so now we're growing. Numbers and an influence. Why? Because time is on the side of truth in the long run. And more people are getting to know us today for what we are instead of what our enemies say we are. You know, some people have a tendency to be down on what they're not up on. Have you ever noticed that? And more people are getting up on the John Birch Society. And so tonight, I come in for your consideration. A good hard look at the John Birch Society. If it isn't us, what's it going to be? And if it isn't now, when's it going to be? Because time is running out in this struggle. Now tonight, when you leave here, you'll notice some literature in the back. May I challenge you to pick it up and read it through? To do as the prophet Hosea said about supplying that lack of knowledge? My people, he said, are destroyed from lack of knowledge. I even dare you, and I assume we've got blue books back there, do we? All right, I even dare you to read the first 30 pages of the blue book and come across the 10 points that Robert Welch announced in December of 1958 at that lecture. The blue book is a transcript of that 2-day lecture that he gave in 1958 when the Birch Society was launched. Within the first 30 pages, you'll see 10 points that Robert Welch says. 10 things that are going to happen as the communists start increasing their grip over this country. Do you know what one of the things was? Wage and price controls. Now, I dare you to find out what the others are. Let me just give you a little clue why I mentioned that. You know wage and price controls inevitably, in fact, Nixon himself, on the 6th of July in Kansas City of this year said, at a background briefing on domestic initiatives to newsmen, he said, we cannot have wage and price controls without rationing. Now, that's what they've got in mind. Now, when they start to ration, and they start to distributing how much gasoline and travel you and I are going to get, how many speeches do you think I'm going to be giving around the country? And when they start deciding how much literature should be printed because of the shortage of pulp for printing pages, etc., how much chance do you think the Birch Society Bulletin and some of these other publications have? You see, I'll tell you, we're moving into the throes of the final stages of a dictatorship. You know how Mussolini ran it? He said to the businessmen in Italy, I won't take over your plants. Tell you what we'll do. We'll tell you how many hours your workers can work. We'll tell you what they can produce. We'll tell you what the wages will be and what the prices are you'll charge on, but you'll own the plant. And that's exactly where we're moving today. Is it not? You bet it is. And so I dare you, I challenge you to read the first 30 pages, if not all of the blue book of the John Birch Society. See what those other 9 points are that he laid it out straight. Well, you've been good sports. I've enjoyed being with you tonight. I've shot from the hip. Hope you didn't mind. Didn't mean to offend anybody here tonight. That wasn't my point in coming, although I'm not the world's greatest diplomat. I'm not like that fellow. Some of you heard about a little fellow. He heard about him probably. He came to the part on the application blank. He was applying for a job, and it came to part of the application blank where it said, are your parents still living, and if not, how did they die? And unfortunately, this chap's father died as a result of a hanging because of a crime he committed, and the boy wasn't very proud of it, but he'd been taught to tell the truth, and yet he was so embarrassed that finally he wrote these words in on the application blank. He said, my father was attending a public function when the platform on which he was standing collapsed. Now, I guess there are a lot of ways to tell the truth, but I don't come from that school of thought, so I've been pretty frank and blunt with you here tonight. I hope you've taken it in the manner it meant to be conveyed. And now I want to close with a little quote. And when I finish with this quote, I want to slip to the back so I can be there during the closing announcements and the benediction in order that I can have the privilege of shaking your hand as you leave, looking into the whites of your eyes, and if you have some questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. The closing quote that both my father and I'm mighty grateful for great support, fight for freedom that he's given. The quote that Edward Everett Hale gave years ago, which both he and I enjoy so much, and which probably a number of you in this room have heard, simply says, I am only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And what I can do, that I ought to do. And what I ought to do, by the grace of God, I shall do. Thank you very much.